so let's begin. There are a few things that I wanted to touch on that we mentioned last week. We actually haven't finished examining this first Mishnah. One of them was a couple of things that I mentioned along the way, but one of them, just take me a second to pull it up, is the whole basis, the scriptural basis. Here's Paul, for doing a Torah reading at this juncture. Just a sec. Here we go. Okay, hello, Paul. So Paul, can you hear us? Can you hear me?
Okay.
Okay.
You are still in Washington?
I'm not, yes, not only am I still in Washington, but I'm going to be here in the States now for another 2 months.
Okay.
I had a grandson born a few days ago. Thank you. In Israel.
Where? Did you go there?
No. It was my daughter who lives, she lives in a moshav near Kfar Saba.
Here in Israel.
In Israel.
Okay.
Yeah, I told her a few days before she gave birth that in the end I'm not going to be back in time. But that's the way it goes. Anyway, he's very cute. Mazal tov to everybody. And yes, okay, let's get down to brass tacks here. So what we were learning about last week was the Kriyat Torah, the Torah reading that the Kohen Gadol did. And I wanted to dive into some of the details here. So one of them was, why was he doing a Kriyat Torah at all? And the Tosas Yom Tov and other Meforshim refer back to, I think it's a Tosas, yeah, Tosas Yom Tov. So here, let's just remind ourselves, the beginning of the Mishnah says, Balo Kohen Gadol Likrot. So the Kohen came to read. I was thinking about this also in terms of the language. In modern Hebrew, when we say Balo, it means that Zemashu Rotzen, like he felt like reading, right? Balo. But that's not what it means here. It means that he came to read. It was not a spur of the moment choice. So Tosas Yom Tov here says, Balo Kohen Gadol Likrot Pirush Rashi Dialfina Mimiluim. Tosas Yom Tov quotes Rashi, who says he learns it out from the Miluim. Yamrina bePerak Kama Minayin Shaf Mikra Parshash Nitztaveh Bi Ve'ata Titzaveh Me'akev Talmud Lomar Vayomer Moshe El Haida Zeh HaDavar Shetziva Hashem Lasot B'Asiyat Miluim B'Tzavet Ha'aron Zeh HaDavar Afilu Dibur Me'akev. So let's explain this. This is in the Gemara that he's referring to, which is in the first chapter. This is part of a much longer, a very interesting sugya, and in this sugya, there's certain comparisons that are made between the avodah of the Kohen Gadol Yom Kippur and the avodah that was done in the installation of Aaron and his sons as Kohanim, which were the Yemei HaMiluim and Yom HaShmini, which was the day of the installation. So I'm just going to quote the part of the sugya that's pertinent and that is here on Daf Hey Amud Bet. And it says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Minayin Sha'af Mikra Parasha Me'akev. Where do we learn that reading the Parsha was Me'akev, right? It held back the mitzvah of the installation of the Kohanim. In other words, from where do I know that one of the things that had to be done on the day that Aaron and his sons were installed, where do I know that they had to also read the portion in the Torah that described their installation? So Talmud Lomar Vayoma Moshe El Ha'edah. So that's over here. Vayoma Moshe El Ha'edah Zeh Hadavar Shetzivah Hashem La'asot. This is the thing, or this is the word that Hashem has commanded to do. So in the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan says, Zadabar Shetzivah Hashem Afilu Dibur Ma'akev. This is the basis for saying that the Dibur, that's speaking about the going out of speaking about the installation itself, is Ma'akev. It was a requirement for that day. And so similarly here in the Mishnah that we're learning, Ba'al Kohen Gadol Likrot, Rashi says that that's the basis for the Kohen Gadol reading these parashot on Yom Kippur. So essentially he's going to read the parashot that the Torah uses to describe Yom Kippur. So of course that's Afrei Mot in modern terms. That's chapter 16 of Vayikra, and then later on the Asur in Parshat Emor, and then of course the Parshat Musaf and Parshat Pinchas. So that was one thing I just wanted to mention, that apparently the reading, here's the question. So was this reading really Dioraita? Was it something that ad kadei kach, that the comparison to the Yomei HaMiluim in this regard meant that min HaTorah, that he had to read in the Torah, or is it something midrabanan and this is an asmachta? And I'm not sure, but
Shel,
yes.
how could they at the time of the in the desert and at the time of the Mishkan, how could they have read in the Torah? The Torah that didn't yet exist.
So
the Moshe wrote his 5 books. I think that they're towards the end of after the 40 years. Yes. That's the way usually it's explained. I don't know.
No, you're asking a very good question. It gets into a discussion about the writing of the Torah itself. So what we know from the pshat of the Torah is what you're saying, which is that in Parshat Vayelech, it says that Moshe wrote down a Torah and he gave it to Shevet Levi. And according to Chazal, he actually wrote 13 Torahs and gave one to each of the Shvatim. But in either event, those were whole Torahs that were written at the end of Moshe's life. So this breaks down into different parts. So one of them is whether the Torah was given all at once, or was it given Megillot? Was it given in sections? So presumably, I think either way, what it would mean, what this drasha in Yoma implies is that at that time, that part of the Torah had already been written. It was already something that had been written down. This is something that Moshe had been writing in sections as he went along. But it's a very good question. I'm going to leave that's the most I'm going to say about it right now. But that's presumably what it is. It could be that it was enough even that he wrote just down the parashot that were pertinent to Miluim. But see, there's several, right? Because we have the description of the Miluim already in Shmot, and then we have in Vayikra. We have different things because the tzivui, the original tzivui, comes up in Shmot, and then it's expanded and detailed in Vayikra. So, and here, here also, because in Achrei Mot, if this is true that what Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, if that applies also to the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim, that would mean it would have applied to Aharon whenever they celebrated Yom Kippur, and it's the same question that you have. So, what was he reading from? So presumably, if all of that was true, it meant that maybe he wasn't reading from a whole Sefer Torah, but maybe he read from some partial Sefer Torah, from some Megillah that had been written. It's an interesting concept, though, right? So the idea is like from the Gemara in the first parak that we just quoted. According to Rabbi Yochanan, the reading of the Torah is ma'akev, the miluim, right? In other words, it was an essential part of the miluim. And here also, it's an essential part of the avodah kippurim, although, as we learned last time, this was not considered technically to be avodah, right? And does anybody remember how we know that from the Mishnah last week?
Yeah, we know that from the dress. He was in mufti at the time when he was reading.
Right, exactly. So at the time he was reading, he had a choice. He could read either in the bigdei boots, which was clothing that was specific to Avodah Yom Kippurim, or he could read in his own chaluk, in his itzlit, which was something that probably looked very similar. It was probably also some kind of a white linen shirt that he would have been wearing. But either way, if he had a choice of what to wear, that tells me it's not avodah per se. That's also relevant for how we understand the end of the day. Right now, we're getting toward the end of the day of Yom Kippur, and what happened to his clothing and all of that, which I think we're going to talk a little bit more about today as well. But it is an interesting thing. Where else? So does anybody know where we have the first formal Kriyat Torah in Tanakh, where it's very explicit that there was a Kriyat Torah?
I mean, it's not the Kriyat that happened in Ezra, was it?
In what?
Not the Kriyat that happened in Ezra, is it? Like after the second.
Yes, it's the Kriyat Torah of Ezra. That's where it's explicit, and that seems to also serve as a kind of a basis for this Kriyat. I should have prepared this. It's something I went over again recently, but I didn't bring it up. I think it actually appears in Nehemiah, if I remember correctly. Second. hold on a second. Oh, I should have brought this up before. I'm sorry, it'll take me a minute to find it. Hold on. It's not here. I don't have that kind of photographic memory. This past week, I was doing a lot of different, I was looking at a lot of different sources. But you should know that even the Rambam didn't always remember exactly where things were. Here we go. It's in Nehemiah Perek Chet. The Rambam himself relates a story. I think this is in his letter to Ibn Tibbon. Ibn Tibbon, who was coming to translate the Moreh Nevuchim. He had hitkatfut, he had a correspondence with the Rambam. And the Rambam there tells him some interesting things about how he understands the nature of translation. And I believe it's also in that letter, though, that he describes. I think it's in that letter where one of the questions that the Rambam faced when he was already in his lifetime was criticism for not having brought specific sources to his halachot in the Mishneh Torah, which, if you understand, at the time that was a huge controversy. This was completely unprecedented, to write a book of halacha where the sources were not obvious, because until then, all the sifrei halacha that preceded him, let's say mostly the Rif and the halachot gedolot, or even the shiltot, all of these books, they weren't written like the Rambam at all. They were kitzurim. They were they were taking excerpts from the Gemara and just putting in the parts that they were using in the halacha. So the sources were obvious, because essentially what they were doing was they were quoting sources. The Rambam was the first Sefer Halacha where he not only completely revamped the order in which Halacha was learned, but he also wrote it in Hebrew, and he also didn't cite sources, so the sources were not obvious. And one of the things that he relates is that somebody came to him and asked him about a source for halacha. He'd written Hilchot Shabbat, and he pulled out a Gemara Shabbat, and he kept looking and looking. He couldn't find it. He couldn't find his own source. And it was only after the fellow left that he remembered that the source wasn't in Masechet Shabbat. It was in a different Masechet altogether. So, not that I'm comparing myself in any shape or form to the Rambam, but even the Rambam could sometimes forget his own sources. So it took me a moment to find.
But he didn't have a computer.
He did not have a computer, which is, I think, both good and bad, right? I think when you don't have that kind of crutch, then you're forced to remember things, right? In a way, I think all of us remember in our own lifetime how many telephone numbers we used to know by heart. And now I barely remember my own telephone number by heart. Anyway, and Michael, what you said that is in Ezra, I'll also just point out that in the Rishonim, Sefer Nehemiah and Ezra was one book. So you're technically correct in that regard. But here is that story. So that story is in Nehemiah פרק ח' ויעשו כל העם כאיש אחד אל הרחוב אשר לפני שער המים. Now you may remember Shar Hamayim, which we pointed out before. Actually, we could do it again. Shar Hamayim was one of the gates that came from the south into the area of the temple. It's going to be one of these here. Okay, if I remember, correctly, it's mentioned in Masechet Midot. It's one, I think it's this shar here. We mentioned it earlier in the Masechet because the first Tevilah, the first time that the Kohen Gadol goes to the mikvah on the day of Yom Kippur, he has to go to the mikvah outside of the temple per se, because he has to be tahor when he walks into the area of the Beit HaMikdash. And there was a mikvah outside of Shar HaMayim. So even though this is not a proportional, map, but I believe, if I remember correctly, that was the place. All right, I won't check it now. I think it was that one. It was either that one or the one above. I think it was this one. And the reality was that certainly in the time of the Second Temple, the area outside of Shar HaMayim was much larger than this, as described in Masechet Midot. So it was somewhere here that they gathered for this Torah reading. Make sure I'm still, yeah, okay. So they said to Ezra the scribe, so they said to bring a Torah, right? The Sefer Torah Moshe. So according to tradition, the Sefer Torah Moshe. So if this meant the Torah that Moshe himself wrote, that was supposed to be stored in the Aron, but there was no Aron in the Second Temple. We learned that actually, it's a Brighton, the Gemara in Yoma, that Yoshia Melech, who understood one of the prophecies to indicate that all of the Kelim from the Beit HaMikdash were going to be exiled. So he went and hid the Aron. And where he hid it is subject of controversy, not only in Steven Spielberg films, but in the Gemara. In any event, so Sefer Torah Moshe, presumably this was a Sefer Torah, which was called Sefer Torah Moshe, but not necessarily the Torah that Moshe himself had written. ויביא עזרא הכהן את התורה לפני הקהל מאיש ועד אישה וכל מבין לשמוע ביום אחד לחודש השביעי. So he brings the Torah before the congregation, and the congregation is made up of me'ish v'ad isha, from man to woman, and all who understood to hear on B'yom echad l'chodesh hashvi'i, on the first day of the 7th month, which was, of course, Rosh Hashanah. Vayikru bo lifnei harachov asher lifnei shar hamayim min ha'or. He read from it, from ha'or, in other words, from the first light of day, ad machtzit hayom, until halfway through the day. Meged ha'anashim ha'anashim v'hamedinim, in front of these people, the women, the men, the women, and those who understood. Yoznechol ha'am al Sefer Torah. The ears of all of the people were toward the Sefer Torah. Vayamod Ezra HaSofer al Migdal Eitz Asher Asu L'Davar. So Ezra HaSofer stood on a tower of wood that was made for the thing. Vayamod Etzel Matitya v'Shema v'Aniya v'Uriya v'Chilkiya Ma'asaya al Yamino. So these various people stood on his right. U'mismalo Pedaya u'Mishael Malkiya v'Chashum v'Chashbadana Zechariah v'Shulam. Vayiftach Ezra HaSefer Le'nei Kol Ha'am. So he opened the book, the Sefer Torah, to the eyes of all of the people, Kimeal Kol Ha'amaya, because he was above everybody else. Ukafitcho Amdu Kol Ha'am. And when he opened it, everybody stood. Actually, most of the Mefarshim here understand that stood doesn't mean that they stood up. It means that they stopped, like Lavmod B'Makom, to stand in place. But it also here, this is the perush that's Yuchas to Rashi, that's attributed to Rashi. Amdu, Rashi says Lashon Shtika. It's a word that means that they were quiet. Amdu v'lo anu od. Like we see elsewhere that they were quiet and they didn't reply anymore about the Chaverim of Yov. And other Mefarshim say that, but it could be that it was both of those things. But what you see here in this Kriya is, this is sort of the, this lays out for us the basis for the way we do Kriyat Torah, that somebody stands and reads the Torah, and then at the end, they hold up the Torah for everybody to see. And that's what Ezra HaSofer did. So this presumably lays out the basis, like the basis for Hilchot Kriyat Torah, the way we do it. There's more here, which we may come back to. The Gemara here actually quotes this passage in reference to the Kriya that the Kohen Gadol did as well. So let's see. So that was the first thing I wanted to point out, that the Kriya itself, even though the Kriya itself is not technically part of the Avodah, there is at least a conceptual basis to say that it's this, because there's similarities to the Miluim and Avodat Yom Kippurim, that this apparently served as a basis for why the Kohen Gadol was going to be reading. So that's one thing. The other thing, I think we left off last time, we were talking about the way the Kriya went, that first he reads Achrei Mot, and then he reads V'ach Be'asor, and then he rolls the Sefer Torah up and puts it b'cheiko. Let's see. So let's go back. We'll just go through the language of the Mishnah. Ba'alo Kohen Gadol likrot, im ratzah likrot b'diktevut koreh, v'im lo koreh b'itztui davar mishelo. Chazan HaKnesset notel Sefer Torah, v'notno l'Rosh HaKnesset, v'Rosh HaKnesset notno l'Askan, v'Askan notno l'Kohen Gadol, v'Kohen Gadol omed v'mekabel v'koreh v'omed. So the Kohen Gadol stands and he accepts the Torah and he reads it standing. And we mentioned last time, this is another reference that I want to look at, that this indicates that he was not that he was doing the Kriya outside of the Beit Mikdash proper, because he would not have been allowed to sit down to, at any moment, he would not have been allowed to sit down in the Beit Mikdash, because only kings in the line of David were allowed to sit in the Beit Mikdash. So we'll come back to that in a second. We'll look a little bit further in the basis for that. בכהן גדול עומד מקבל בקורא עומד וקורא אחרי מות ואח בעשור וגולל ספר תורה ממיכל בחיקו ואומר יותר ממה שקראתי לפניכם כתוב כאן. More than that which I read before you is written here. And then ובעשור שבחומש הפקודים קורא על פה. Then he would read Parshat Uve'asor, which is the Musaf in Parshat Pinchas, that's in Chumash HaPekudim, in Bamidbar. He reads by heart. By the way, so we know that Chumash HaPekudim is what the Chazal called Bamidbar. And why was Bamidbar called Chumash HaPekudim? What are pekudim? What does that mean?
Maybe the mifkad. There were several mifkads there, if I remember. I'm not sure.
So what's a mifkad?
Well, the people have to be. It's a census. How do you say in English?
Yeah, they were counted.
Counted.
Yeah, that's the beginning of Parshat, Parshat Bamidbar. You're right. There's a counting. We've coded Bnei Israel, so that Chazal called Bamidbar Chumash HaPekudim. Like you said, there's more than one census, right? There are different censuses, so that's why it's called Chumash HaPekudim. And we'll see elsewhere that. The Sefer Vayikra was called Torah Kohanim. Nowadays, if you say Torah Kohanim, if you see it in literature, it usually refers to the Midrash Sifra. The halachic Midrash on Vayikra is also called Torah Kohanim. But in the language of Chazal, Torah Kohanim refers to Vayikra itself. Anyway, so then he reads Chumash HaPekudim by heart. So this is apparently what he was introducing when he said, more than what I have read before you is written here. And then he reads the Musaf of Parshat Pinchas. He reads that by heart. So why did he have to declare that more than what I have read before you is written here? Why should he say anything? Why doesn't he just roll up the first Sefer Torah and then read the rest of it by heart? Why does he have to make this declaration?
We talked about last week that he skips, and you're not allowed to skip. So this was a way to tell people that he was skipping and that they shouldn't think that this is everything there is.
He should. Okay, so the one issue is that he's not allowed to skip. He's not allowed to skip ahead more than the time it would take for the mitargem, right? For the translator to finish translating his last verse. So that allowed him to skip from Achrei Mot to Parshat Emor, what we call, Parshat Achrei Mot and Parshat Emor, because that's very close. It's really just a couple of seconds, depending on how their Sifrei Torah were written. You would only have to roll a couple of times to get there. But to roll all the way to the end of Bamidbar, which is where he would find the Musaf, that would take too long. So he has to make this declaration. So so that people don't think that the reason that he's reading by heart is because there's something wrong with the Sefer Torah that he was reading from. There's also this idea that's built in here of Kvod HaTorah, we talked last week, we mentioned there's this idea of kvod hatzibur. There's the respect that is due to the public that's in attendance, and we don't allow him to take time to roll the Sefer Torah, which is going to leave the people just sitting and doing nothing and waiting around for the next part of the Kriya, because that's not respectful to the people who are there. But there's also an idea that we don't want to, in any way, to damage the respect that's due to the Torah, and we don't want people to think that there's a problem with this Sefer Torah, and that's why he's not reading from it. So he has to make this declaration to say, more than what I've read to you is written here, meaning I'm going to read by heart something that is actually written here, but I'm not going to roll to that place. But he wants them to know that this is also part of the written Torah. So he has to make that declaration in order that people don't think that there was a problem with this Sefer Torah, or that the Sefer Torah itself was not whole. And then he says 8 brachot on it, and then then it lists Al HaTorah, Al Havodah, Al Hoda'ah, right, on the Torah, on the service, on the acknowledgement or thanks, Al Mechilat Avon, on the forgiving of sin, Al Mikdash Bifnei Atzmo, on the Mikdash by itself, on Al Yisrael by themselves, Al Yushalayim Bifnei Atzma, Yushalayim by itself, Al Kohanim Bifnei Atzman, on the Kohanim by themselves, Al Shar HaTfilah, and on the rest of the davening. So here we have another problem, because it says that he afterwards he says 8 brachot, but how many brachot are listed here? You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So first of all, it seems to list 9, and Od Yoter, we'll see that Al HaTorah, there were actually 2 brachot, the same way we have 2 brachot on the Torah. So really it's alluding to 10. But we'll also notice that 4 of these brachot, it says that he were bifnei atzman, right? They were by themselves. That implies what about the other brachot?
That they're not by themselves.
That they're not by themselves, or not necessarily by themselves. So it could be that some of these brachot might have been combined. We'll come back to this. What we're going to see is, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but we're going to see that actually there are other girsaot which Rishonim had in this Mishnah, and also the Rishonim has a different girsa. So it's easier to count the brachot. This girsa is actually very, very difficult. We'll come back to it. Let's go back though, just a couple of the other things here that the Bartanura references. So Omedu Mikabel. So one of the things that we mentioned is that the Kohen Gadol, the Sefer Torah, is passed to him from these other people, and then he stands up and he receives it. Bartanura said, "Miklal da'at hashta yoshev hava." So this implies that until now he had been sitting. So then we find that we learned the Bezrat Nashim Hayakore. He was sitting, he was reading in the Ezrat Nashim, the Bezrat Yisrael, because if he had been in the Ezrat Yisrael, the Hosheken, the Makom HaMekudash Yoter Mimena, And all the more so if he had been in a place that was even holier than Ezrat Yisrael, Asur Le'shev. It would be forbidden for him to sit down, except for the kings of the house of David. It was permitted for them to sit in the Azarat. David HaMelech came and sat before Hashem. So where do we find that? That's in Shmuel Bet Perek Zayin. Let's bring that up. Skip over to there. So what's the context for this? Because you could ask a simple question. What could be the source that would tell me that Malchei Beit David could sit in the Beit HaMikdash? How could you bring a source from David HaMelech?
He
David,
didn't yet build the Beit HaMikdash.
right, he never sat in the Beit HaMikdash because it wasn't, right, explicitly there was no Beit HaMikdash. So how is this a source? How is this pasuk a source for David HaMelech that he himself could have sat in the Beit HaMikdash? So let's take a moment and look at this.
In the Mishkan, no? The Mishkan was there, no? I think so.
Well, so let's see. This is the chapter where he discusses that he wants to build the Beit HaMikdash. King was sitting in his house, and Hashem had he had not sure how to translate that here. He had left him around from all his enemies. How does he'd given him rest from all his enemies, right? So if you remember in Sefer Dvarim, when the idea of building the Beit HaMikdash is introduced, it also comes in the wake of after all of the enemies have been conquered is when you're supposed to build a Beit HaMikdash. So arguably, it actually took until the time of David to get to this point. And at that point, Vayomer HaMelech el Natan HaNavi, so the king David says to Natan the prophet, Reina anochi yoshev beveit harazim, va'aron ha'elohim yoshev b'toch ha'yiriyah. I'm sitting in this house of cedar, right? He had this fine house that was built from cedar that had been brought from Lebanon. And the Aron of God is sitting b'toch ha'yiriyah, sitting in the sheet, right? In other words, it was sitting in Shiloh, and it was in a building that didn't have yet a permanent roof. It still had the yiriot of the Mishkan that were covering it. Everything that's in your heart you should go and do. Ki Hashem imach, Hashem is with you. And we know this story is expanded on in Divrei Hayamim. But of course, what he wants to do is build the Beit HaMikdash. And at first, Natan encourages, but then Vahi Balayla Hahu Vahi Natan more. And that night, the word was to Natan from Hashem. David, El David, Kol Mar Hashem, Ha'ata Tivneh Li Bayit L'Shivti. Are you going to build a house for me to dwell in? Ki lo yashavti b'vayit l'miyom ha'aloti et b'nei Yisrael mi'mitzrayim v'ad hayom hazeh. Not dwelt in a house from the time that I took you, the children of Israel, out of Egypt until this day. V'heyeh mitalech b'ohel v'mishkan. And I have gone in a tent in a mishkan. V'chol asher hitalachti b'chol b'nei Yisrael ha'davar דיברתי את אחד שבטי ישראל אשר ציוויתי לראות את עמי ישראל לאמור, למה לא בניתם לי בית ארזים? In all that I've gone with the children of Israel, did I ever say to you, why haven't you built me a house? why haven't you built me a house of cedar? Kolmar Hashem Tzavakot, Ani lekachticha min hanaveh mi'achar hatzon li'od nagid al ami al Yisrael. I chose you as the leader of Israel. I raised you from your humble beginnings. V'yeh imcha b'chol asher halachta, and I will be with you, or I was with you in everything that you have gone. V'achrita et kol oyevecha mipanecha. I've cut down all of your enemies from before you. Right? I've given you a great name. V'samti makom le'amili Yisrael netati v'shachan tachtav v'lo yirgaz od v'lo yusifu b'nei avla v'amelto kasher barishona. I've given a place to Israel, to my people Israel, and I've planted them there and so forth. Min hayom asher tziviti shoftim al Yisrael v'anichoti l'cha mikol oyevecha v'yigid l'cha Hashem ki vayit yaseh l'cha Hashem. From the day that I commanded the shoftim, the judges on my people Israel, I've given you rest from your enemies. And Hashem would tell you that Kibayit Yaseh L'cha Hashem. Your days will be filled, and you will lie with your fathers. And I will uphold your seed after you, that will come from your loins. Right? I've prepared or given a foundation for in other words, for your seed's kingdom. Hu yivne bayit lishmi. Right, so he's going to build a house for me. I will be for him as a father. He will be for me as a son. If he sins, in other words, in his sinning, and I will reprove him with the staff of men, with the gaim, with the can't think of words. The stripes of children, the stripes of the children of men. Okay, Negaim, like I can't think. Whatever.
A wealth.
Well, nega is, remember, nega is the word that the Torah uses for tzarat. It's a negative. It's for not necessarily just wealth, but what do you call it when you get like not just a wealth, but
Magefa comes from negev.
That's with the fed. This is nega. Negaim. Right, negaim.
Not negev.
No, b'shem uvenigei b'nei adam. We don't. I can't think of the word, but like petza.
Sores and bruises.
Yeah, like sores and bruises, something like that. All he's saying is that he's now, God is telling David that he's not going to build the Beit HaMikdash. His son is going to build the Beit HaMikdash. His kingdom is going to continue on. And he's saying that, you know, if your son or any of your offspring, any of your descendants sin against me, then I'm going to reprove them and I'm going to even strike them. But so that seems to be a reference to, you know, as opposed to what happened to Shaul, right? Because with Shaul, when Shaul sinned against God, he lost the kingdom. And he's saying to David, he's saying to David, you don't have to worry that after you die, the Beit HaMikdash is going to be built by your son, and your son's kingdom will continue. I'm not giving the kingdom to anybody else. And if he or any of your offspring, any of your descendants stray from my command, I'm not going to take the kingdom away from your line. Instead, I'm going to reprove them or even, punish them. But they still, that seems to be the emphasis here. He's promising David that no matter what happens, the line of David is still going to continue. The chasdi lo yasur mimenu. My kindness is not going to be taken away from him. Asher kasher hasiroti mi'im Shaul, the way I took it away from Shaul. Asher hasiroti milfanecha, that I took him away from before you. V'ne'eman beitcha mamlachta ad olam. Right, so all of these are promises that the kingdom of David and his line are going to continue. So all of this was a vision that Natan Hanavi had that night, and he relates it to David. So now it comes to our pasuk. Vayavo hamelech David vayeshev lifnei Hashem. So the king David comes and he sits before God, literally sits before God. Vayomer mi anochi Hashem Elokim u'mi veiti ki haviyotani ad halom. Who am I that you brought me until now? So where was he sitting when he sat before Hashem? It says lifnei Hashem. Now, when we have this term lifnei Hashem, we have many drashot in the Torah of Lifnei Hashem that means that something takes place in the Beit HaMikdash, right? Like taking the Lulav and Etrog Lifnei Hashem, that's where we learn that in the Beit HaMikdash, Midoraita, they used to take Lulav and Etrog every day of the 7 days, because there it says Lifnei Hashem. And in Gvulin, outside of the Beit HaMikdash, the only mitzvah was on the first day, because there's another pasuk that leaves out the Lifnei Hashem. So here, what's the Lifnei Hashem? Rashi says Lifnei Ha'aron. In other words, he went and sat before the Aron, which was not in a Beit HaMikdash, but was in a kind of a Mishkan, in kind of a temporary Beit HaMikdash, and he sat there. The idea of him sitting, however you understand it, Lifnei Hashem, sorry, I'm opening up windows here that I don't want, just a second. However you understand it, even in the Pshuto Shel Mikra, is David has now sat before the presence of God. So whether that meant he sat in front of the Aron or he Echshahu, right? Somehow he has placed himself in a situation where he is sitting before God. This is the source. The fact that he sat before God and addresses God tells us that he had permission to do this, right? In other words, otherwise, presumably he would have been punished for sitting before God. So what does he do? So the rest of it, of course, is that he humbles himself before God, and he accepts that God is not going to let him build the Beit HaMikdash, and he thanks God, and he has a little prayer at the end. The Radak here says, "Vayashav lifnei Hashem lifnei ha'aron." He learns like Rashi that he sat in front of the Aron. Mikan samchu rabotenu zichronam livracha she'en yeshiva ba'azara ela l'malchei Beit David. This is the source, as we see from the Bartanur. The Bartanur is bringing, it's a drasha in the Gemara here, that the kings of the house of David were allowed to sit in the Azara. And some of them said even for the kings of the house of David, they weren't allowed to sit. Shenemar Srafim Omdim Imal Lo, K'tiv B'chol Tzavah Shemayim Omdim Alav. Right, that even the angels did not sit before Hashem; they all stood before Hashem. וכתיב בין העומדים האלה מעלה אין ישיבה בדוד יושב, ומהו וישב בפני השם, מהם אמרו ששמח עצמו, ומהם אמרו שישב עצמו בתפילה. So some people say it meant that he literally sit down, but other people said no, even David couldn't sit down. It means shesamach atzmo, that he was leaning on something. So it was like he was sitting down, but he wasn't actually sitting. And some people say that he wasn't literally sitting at all, but he had settled himself into a tefillah, which is the context here. So those are other alternate understandings of the pasuk. But what we understand, the Gemara here on our Mishnah brings this drasha, that this is the basis for Malchei David to sit before Hashem. So I think it's a particularly interesting source, not only because it literally says that David is sitting before God, but the context is, in fact, about the building of the Beit HaMikdash, and that David himself is not going to build the Beit HaMikdash, but nonetheless, he finds himself in a situation where, according to this drasha, he is physically sitting down in the presence of God in this context, in the context of building a Beit HaMikdash. So that's that. That's where we learn it from. Let's go back to the Mishnah. And okay, so and the other thing actually I wanted to do, I forgot, before we go back to the Mishnah, just a second. I told everybody they could look this up, but we'll take a moment and I'll just show you this in the halacha. This is in the Tur in Hilchot Kriyat Torah. The Tur summarizes these halachot. Medalgin b'navi ve'en medalgin b'torah. We can skip in Navi, right? When you're reading the Haftarah, you can skip from one within a Navi, but en medalgin b'torah. Piresh shelo yidaleg mi parsha zu leparasha acher. You can't skip from one parsha to another parasha. So parasha here doesn't mean Parshat HaShavua. It means the divisions in the way the Torah is laid out. It's laid out into parashot Ptuchot and parashot Stumot. You're not allowed to skip from one parsha to another. V'hanei mili b'shnei inyanim. And when are you not allowed to skip? If it's two different subjects. Because we have to worry that maybe those who are listening are going to get confused. But if it's one matter, if it's one subject, like if you're reading Achrei Mot and then you want to continue reading Ach Be'asor, Shekohen Gadol Koreh Yoma Kippurim, that the Kohen Gadol reads on Yom Kippur, they're both of the same subject, Midalgim. There you're allowed to skip, as we see from our Mishnah, right? So this is actually brought down the halacha. Uvenavi Midalgim, in Navi you can skip afilu bishnei inyanim. If it's the Navi that you're reading from, you're allowed to skip even between two subjects. And both this and this is in the time that it would take before the translator would stop translating. Perush shelo yishaheh b'dilug, meaning he shouldn't tarry in his skipping. El b'chdei sheyashlim turgaman pasuk shetirgem. Only given enough within the time that it will take for the turgaman to translate his pasuk. In other words, the last pasuk that was read directly from the Torah. She'en kavod l'tzibur lamod b'shtika, because it's not respectful for the tzibur to stand quietly. V'chein ein gololin sefer Torah b'tzibur mipnei kavod hatzibur. You don't roll a sefer Torah in the tzibur because of kavod tzibur. Now, there's another related halacha here. Ein korin la'adam echad b'shnei sifrei Torah. You don't call up one person to read from two different sifrei Torah. Mishum pegamo shel rishon, because it would be a pegam, it would be like insulting to the first one. Shelo yamru chaserhu, so they wouldn't say that it's missing. This is what, and this is also learned out from what our Mishnah is talking about, that one of the questions we asked is, okay, so I understand he reads the first two parashot, he reads Achrei Mot and Ach Be'asor, he reads that from the Sefer Torah that was brought out, and he's allowed to skip from one parsha to the next because there's enough time for the Turgaman to finish translating the last pasuk of Achrei Mot before he rolls the Torah to Ach Be'asor. But then why does he roll up the Torah? Why doesn't he just bring another Sefer Torah? Why doesn't he read from a second Sefer Torah? So the idea is what is being expressed here. You're not allowed to call one person to read from two Sifrei Torah. So that, why not? Because people will think that if he read from a second Sefer Torah, they'll think that there was something, whatever he's reading was missing from the first Sefer Torah. Shosha Gavre, right? Three people, B'Shosha Svarim, with three Sifrei Torah, Kigon, Rosh Chodesh Tevet, Shachal Liot B'Shabbat, Lo Habi P'gima. You're allowed to call up even three different people to read from three different Sifrei Torah, as long as each one is only reading from one Sefer Torah. And of course, that does happen sometimes when Rosh Chodesh Tevet falls out on Shabbat, and you have to take out a Torah for the Parsha, and for Rosh Chodesh, and for Chanukah, right? So that's when we take out three Sifrei Torah. And why are we allowed to do that? So that's not the same as having one person read from two Sifrei Torah. You're allowed to have even three people read from three Sifrei Torah. But if one person reads from two Sifrei Torah, then we're afraid that people will think that there was something wrong with the first Sefer Torah. And specifically that the first Sefer Torah was chaser, that it was missing the part that he was reading. So this also fits into the language, and the language that the Kohen Gadol says, that more than what I've read is written here. In other words, again, what he's doing is he's saying there's nothing missing from this Sefer Torah. And the implication is, I'm going to read to you the next parsha by heart, not because it's not here in the Sefer Torah, but because I'm not allowed to roll to that space, because that wouldn't be respectful of you, the tzibur, to make you wait until then. And that's,
So
yes.
it seems to be that an underlying assumption here is that the general public or the laity is not that familiar with the contents of Chumash.
Well, or even if they were, but you know what? So first of all, let you finish. Why do you say that? How is that implied?
Well, not necessarily in the. I mean, in the rule that one person is not allowed to read from two different Sifrei Torah. The assumption seems like if somebody knew the text, they would know, okay, no, this is not lacking. Although, no, actually, no, that's a faulty assumption. Never mind that. I'm realizing that my reasoning.
Okay, so why is it a faulty assumption? Why are you stopping yourself?
I'm stopping myself because it would be reasonable for people to assume that, like they may be familiar with Chumash. Like it could be that was that the second passage is, it could be reasonably assumed the second passage is lacking from that specific sefer, I suppose. Yeah, from the,
Yes. No, so this is good. Michael, what you did is very good because you went through one possibility and then you said it's not necessarily so. So one possibility is maybe people don't understand that a complete Sefer Torah will also have Parshat Pinchas. But maybe it's not that, it's just that there's a chashash, there's a fear that maybe they'll think there's something wrong with that specific Sefer Torah, that it was not a complete Sefer Torah. So this also implies that when you read from a Sefer Torah, you have to read from a complete Sefer Torah. That gets into other interesting issues about, Kriyat Torah. And so we're familiar with this in modern halacha, and what's been accepted for, generally speaking, for several hundred years as halacha, is that when you do a kriya b'tzibur, when you do a public reading of the Sefer Torah, you have to read from a complete Sefer Torah that's a kosher Sefer Torah. One of the things that makes it kosher is that it's complete in every way, that it's not even missing a letter, it's not even missing, it doesn't even have one letter that's pasul. And that fits into this whole idea that the reason that you're not allowed to have one person read from two Sifrei Torah is we don't want anybody to think that there was a psul in the first Sefer Torah, and again, specifically that maybe it's even missing a whole section. We don't want people to think that. And why wouldn't we want them to think that? So one way of understanding it is that, again, that's a pigam in kvod Torah. That's an affront to the honor of that specific Torah, right? We don't want people to think that that Torah is somehow less than kosher, less than what it should be. I will point out, if we ever take time, maybe if we learn Masechet Megillah, I think after we finish Yoma, I think we'll finish the triumvirate and we'll do Masechet Sukkah. But maybe at some point we'll learn Masechet Megillah, where we learn a lot of the halachot of Kriyat Torah. It gets into an interesting discussion because it wasn't actually agreed upon by all the Rishonim that when you did Kriyat Torah, you had to do it from a kosher Sefer Torah. Even the Ramban in one of his tshuvot and the Rambam in one of his tshuvot actually support the idea that you don't have to read the Parsha from a kosher Sefer Torah, which sounds strange to our ears. There were other Rishonim that held that, but there are bases for that from different ways of learning the Gemara and Kitin and elsewhere. And then you might ask, so what's the point of having a kosher Sefer Torah? The point of having a kosher Sefer Torah would be to fulfill the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah. So that's a mitzvah d'oraita. Torah tells you that you have to write a Sefer Torah. So in order to fulfill the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah, you have to write a complete and whole and kosher Sefer Torah. But reading the Torah in general is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. And maybe the Rabbanan were not machmir, right? They weren't so stringent as to say that you always have to read from a kosher Sefer Torah. Maybe it's sufficient to read from even a pasul Sefer Torah. So that's another interesting discussion. But everything that we've been talking about here, it seems to indicate that his kriya, he wants everybody to understand that kriya is done from a whole Sefer Torah. And that's why he does what he did. So what we see is, unlike the kriya that, let's say, we do on Yom Kippur, where we call up, right? We call up 6 people plus a maftir. The Kohen Gadol was the only person who was as it were, called to the Torah. He was the only koreh. He was the only one who was reading. And so since he's the only one who's reading, he's only allowed to read from a single Sefer Torah. So now we understand the whole story in its context. He's only allowed to read from a single Sefer Torah because if he reads from a second Sefer Torah, people might think there was something missing from the first Sefer Torah. And he can only read parashot that are close enough together that it doesn't take very much time for him to roll from one parsha to the next. And he's not allowed to read then from Parshat Pinchas because it takes too long to roll there. So that puts together all these things, but it's unlike what we're familiar with in terms of halacha, because nowadays there's nothing wrong with reading from more than one Sefer Torah. If you have parashot that are far apart, you can bring out a second Sefer Torah, but then you have to call up somebody else to read from that Torah. You're not allowed to have the same person who had whatever Shvi'i at the end of whatever given Parsha, and let's say it's a day, let's say it's Rosh Chodesh, so you're also going to read from Parshat Pinchas. He's not then allowed to read from Parshat Pinchas, from a second Sefer Torah. You call up somebody else. So that's what we do. So what we do doesn't contradict in any way with the Kohen Gadol. His kriya was exceptional. It was different than the way we read, right? Because he's the only one who's being called up. Okay, in the last few minutes, I have a feeling we're going to have to leave some of this for next week, but let's just lay out a little bit about these brachot, and then we'll stop there for today. Just a sec. Yeah, okay. All right, so now, Mevarech aleh shmone brachot. So he blesses on it 8 brachot. He blesses on it, presumably on the kriya. He blesses 8 brachot, and they are al haTorah. So, just a second. Right, so I'm sorry, I'm just going to read these 2 Perushim, the Bar Tanura, for these 3. The Koreach Remot V'ach Besor. This is just going to summarize what I just said, but I think let's read it anyway. And he reads Ach Remot and Ach Besor Shebaparshat Emor. Shemutar Daleg B'Torah B'Inyan Echad. He's allowed to skip in the Torah in one subject, Keshu Karov, when it's nearby. The time that it would take that the Turgaman would not finish. But if before he would be able to roll the Torah to the place that he needs to get to, the Turgaman would finish his translation, then he's not allowed to skip and to roll there, because then we find that the congregation is sitting and waiting expectantly. That's not kvod hatzibur. This is his declaration. More than what I have read is before you was written here. And why does he say that? So he doesn't cast aspersions on the actual Sefer Torah that he was holding. When they see him reading the 3rd parsha by heart, they will think Sefer Torah chaser ota parasha. They'll think that Sefer Torah was missing that parsha. So he has to tell them that's not the case. It's far away from Parshat Achremot. Ve'ach be'asur yoter mikdei shiafsika turgaman. right? So it's away from Achremot and even from Ach Be'asor, from Parshat Amor, more than it would take time for the Turgaman to finish. Therefore, he can't roll the Sefer Torah until there. Because you don't roll the Sefer Torah in the Tzibur because of the honor that's due to the Tzibur. The Sefer Torah acher eino yachol lavi. You can't bring another Sefer Torah mishum pigamo shorishon, because of the pigam that it would imply about the first Sefer Torah. Shelo yomru harishon chaserhu, so they wouldn't say that the first one is missing that parsha. Okay, so that's a quick summary of everything that we just discussed. So now we have the brachot. So these are the brachot as the Bartenura understands them. Al HaTorah, shtei brachot, achat lefanea v'achat le'achareh, kederach shemavarkin b'veit HaKnesset. So the first one that's mentioned, Al HaTorah, is really two brachot, asher bachar banu v'asher natan lanu, that we're all familiar with. So it means that when he started the Kriya, before he would actually read, he would say, Asher Bachar Banu. When he finished the Kriya, then he would say, Asher Natan Lanu Torat Emet, and so forth. Those are two brachot. V'al ha'avodah, v'al ha'hoda'ah. So those are the brachot that we're familiar with from Shmona Esrei, Ritzei, and Modim. Now, presumably, and we talked about this when we were learning Masechet Tamid, because parts of these are also said in the Beit HaMikdash every day. So presumably the Nusach was different, because we say Hamachazir Shechinato L'Tzion, and they wouldn't have said that because they were in a time when there was a Beit HaMikdash, and Hashem isn't returning the Shekhinah was supposed to be there at the time. So the Nusach for these would have been different, but it tells you that the basic Nusach already existed at that time. And then it had to be modified after the destruction of the temple. Okay, so far we have four. We have two for the Torah, and then we have Ritzei and Modim. We have Al Mechilat Avon, Slach Lanu. That's another bracha. V'al HaMikdash, Shetishre Bo Shechina. V'al HaKohanim, Shitbarchu V'yu Korbanotam L'Ratzon. That there's a bracha for the Kohanim that they should be blessed and that their korbanot should be for taken with the will of God. V'al Yisrael, okay, so we had two for Torah, then we had 3 avodah, 4 hoda'ah, 5 mechilat avon, 6 hamikdash, 7 for hakohanim, V'al Yisrael v'al shar hatfilah. Mefaresh b'Gemara tchina rina bakasha milfanecha. The Gemara explains that this was a supplication and a rina, like a praise or a singing, and a request from before you. Shamcha Yisrael tzrichin lihivasha, because your people Israel need to be, they need Yeshua, they need your salvation. Baruch atah Hashem shomei tefillah. So this is how the Bartenura gets 8, right? So he does 2 for Torah, 3 for Avodah is 3, Hoda'ah is 4, Mechilat Avon is 5, Mikdash is 6, Kohanim is 7, and Yisrael, the Al-Shar HaTfilah is 8. Those are combined. So that seems to not be at all like the Nusach that we have. First of all, it leaves out entirely the Al Yerushalayim. And if you leave out Al Yerushalayim, right, then he puts Al Yisrael. Here it says Al Yisrael b'fnei atzman, and in his nusach Al Yisrael b'al-shar hatfilah is in fact 1. It's not Yisrael b'fnei atzman. So that's his nusach. Next week we'll look at this a little bit more, and then we'll go on. It's a little bit of an insight, though. In other words, so what do we understand? the anchoring principle seems to be that the Mishnah itself says that he blessed 8 blessings. It didn't have to give us the number, but it gave us a number. So the fact that it gave us a number, that seems to be the strong aspect of this tradition. It was known that the Kohen Gadol, at this point, when he's reading the Torah, is going to end up saying 8 brachot. But exactly which were the brachot and the order that they were said in, that seems to be not as clear, right? So we have our Mishnah here. We have clearly a different nusach in the Bar Tanura, and next week I'll show you some other nuschaot. But it's a little bit of an insight to davening in the Beit HaMikdash. So that's it for today. Any last questions or comments? Okay. So, if it snows, I hope everybody can enjoy the snow a little bit. And if it just rains, then stay in and stay dry.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.